Alright, this is video lecture number 4 in this series, and this will be the last video lecture for section 1, which will lead us into exam 1. Just like our quizzes, you can check in to take the exam anywhere between 9 a.m. and 11:59 p.m. on that day, but this time you'll have 1 hour to take the exam. Now, if you miss this exam, you cannot make it up unless you have pre-approval through me, but that needs to be done ahead of time. So again, no makeups for exam 1 if you happen to miss it, so please mark this in your calendar. We're going to continue with radio. We're going to finish up with radio today, and then our next section we're going to move into television. But we want to talk about a couple things with radio, the importance of different types of shows and different types of things that radio is starting to do from the 1930s all the way up to today. And so we need to talk about the importance of music and shows on radio. So now we've got the radio in place. We need to create content. We need to create something for the listeners to listen to. Now we talked about the golden age of radio being in the 1930s. We saw the upstart of the networks and the viability of networks. We have CBS and we have NBC. NBC had the red and blue network, and eventually they sold one of them. 40% of all of NBC network's programming in the 30s was considered music of some type, but we don't have any format of types of music like we have today. It was just music, random music here and there. And actually NBC did something kind of unique, is they had their own in-house orchestra, and so they had live daily music from this orchestra that they would play. And people would actually tune in at a certain time of day or night and listen to these shows. Some of the smaller stations that were not affiliated with the networks would just play records. So we had some records back then. They didn't make as much money. They weren't as listened to as much because people wanted to tune in and listen to the networks, even though they really didn't know what the networks were. Besides music, we see the insurgence of different types of shows on radio. And then one of the more popular shows was called the Comedy Variety Show. And Jack Benny had one of the most popular radio shows and then actually transitioned over into TV. But it was really radio's first big format breakthrough, if you will. We didn't have the term format yet, but looking back now, we see that it was a format, so to speak, because it was something different. It was unique. Jack Benny's program was ethnic, minstrel humor. We had a lot of different types of comedy skits in his show. His show actually ran from 1932 to 1965, and then he transitioned over into TV a little bit. We'll talk about that when we get into the notes there. But here's a little taste of his show.
Program coming to you from New York City and starring Jack Benny, with Mary Livingston, Phil Harris, Dennis Day, Rochester, and yours truly, Don Wilson. Well, guess what, friends? On the way over here to the studio, a guy rushed up to me and said, "Gosh, I'm glad you're going back on the air. Why, I haven't eaten anything for breakfast since you stopped telling me what to have." Well, I hope the rest of you haven't been going without breakfast all summer.
So that was that Jack Benny show. I don't know if you could hear it very well. It's kind of a low quality program there, but these were shows. A lot of them were live. They had soundtracks of people clapping and sound effects and people making the sound effects and different things. And so it was a very popular show, and a lot of people tuned in just like they do today with different TV shows. The other type of radio program was called the situation comedy, or what we call today is sitcoms. It became very, very popular. One of the most popular shows of the sitcom era in radio was called Amos and Andy. It was two white actors portraying one being a black person and one being a white person. It was almost like an Abbott and Costello team, if you will, but it was considered the first serial show. It was the most popular radio show in history because of this. It originated from WMAQ in Chicago, and I'll play a little clip of that show here in a second. But it had a lot of pluses. People loved to listen to it. It influenced the development of dramatic radio, and again, it was the first serial show, so it actually built, from show to show, it actually built a progression of these characters, and one show would leave off, and then the next show would pick up from where it left off. It did have some criticism. It was a very racist program, but back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, people tolerated it, and of course the times are different today, and so a show like this probably wouldn't make it. The characters of the show, Amos was your basic naive but honest, hardworking character. Andy was the more inflated person. And then we had this villain called the Kingfish, Stevens, and he was always trying to get these guys into trouble. And I don't know if you've ever heard this term, holy mackerel, but holy mackerel was basically originated from this show. The two characters, the two actors, their names were...
And tell me one thing, is you a Democrat or is you a Republican?
Well, I was a Democrat, but I believe I've done switched over to the Republicans now.
Who is the man that is running against each other this year election time? Explain that to me.
Herbert Hoover, Vesuvius Al Smith.
Herbert Hoover, Vesuvius Al Smith, huh?
Yeah.
Another thing I want to ask you. What is the difference between a Democrat and a Republican?
Well, one of them is a mule and the other one is an elephant. That's the way I get it.
I don't know if I was going to be a Democrat or a Republican, you know it?
Well, what was your ancestor?
My aunt didn't have no sister.
No, not your aunt's sister. Your ancestors. I mean, how did your old man vote?
Oh, my papa, you mean?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, Papa used to always vote for the Democrat.
Well, then if I was in your place, I would vote for the Republican.
How come?
'Cause I ain't never knowed your old man to do nothing right in his life.
Wait a minute now, wait a minute. Don't say no more about him now.
Well, on the other hand, though, I believe you ought to vote for the Democrats 'cause you look more like a mule than anything I know.
Well, I was willing to be whichever is the best one. I don't care. I'm willing to be either one.
Well, then let's be Democrats and vote for Herbert Hoover. Wait a minute, though. Wait a minute. What is he?
Herbert Hoover is a Democrat, ain't he?
He was a Democrat. Maybe he done changed over.
I believe you got that wrong, ain't you?
Yeah, that's right. Hoover is a Republican. But if you like Hoover, you can still vote for him and be a Democrat.
Well, tell me this. I'm going to ask you another question here.
What's that?
So that was a little snippet from the show. I didn't realize it was going to start so quick. It cut me off. But we had those two white gentlemen, actors portraying Amos and Andy. Very successful radio show on the program, and people actually tuned in every week to listen to it. CBS, we talked about this network a little bit, but I want to kind of just go back and just kind of review a couple things. But by 1933, or by 1933, we had 97 radio stations in their network. It was the nation's largest radio network in the 30s. One of the other programs that CBS actually introduced, as far as we had sitcoms and serial dramas and things like that, but one of the things they did was they came out with something called The Quiz Show, and they had a show called Professor Quiz in 1936, and it was a very popular show. And we'll talk more in detail about quiz shows and their success on TV when we get into that next session. The other type of radio program was serial dramas. It was primarily created for women, and this is our first taste of soap operas. These were programs that originated at night, and then they moved into the daytime. Now, you got to remember the time, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, there was not a lot of women working outside of the home. So these women were home, being housewives, doing their thing at home, and so the radio programmers realized that once the children came home from school and the husbands came home from school, the women really didn't have a lot of time to do free stuff. So they moved the serial dramas to the daytime so the women could listen during the day while they did their stuff. They were daily shows. They only lasted for about 15 minutes. And the word soap opera was coined by the press in the 1930s. So the word soap opera actually was invented or created during the radio days. And this was really the start of what we call today a target marketing. We actually marketed it to a specific audience, and in this case it was women. The first sponsor of the serial drama for women was Colgate-Palmolive, and we'll talk here in a few minutes about the word soap opera and where that came from as far as how that ties into the sponsorship. NBC had a program called The Guiding Light, and it premiered in 1937, and actually was the longest running serial drama for women when you combine it both with radio and TV. It ran from 1937 to 2009. So very long, very popular, very money-making program for women. By the 1940s, serial dramas represented over 90% of all commercially sponsored daytime broadcast hours. So even back early in the 40s, marketers really saw the impact of target marketing and how it could affect not only ratings but profits for their companies, and so they really steered all their programming towards women, because you got to understand that's all they had to do. I mean, other than their working stuff that they did at the home, their release, if you will, was to turn the radio on and listen to stuff. So they loved listening to these radio programs. And in fact, CBS had so many programs. They actually had over 20 programs for women during the 1930s and the early 1940s. Now, the word soap opera was coined by the press, like I said before. And basically, soap opera was coined because of all of the sponsorships of these serial-driven dramas for women were basically household cleaning product companies, Procter & Gamble, Palmolive, whatever it might be. So the marketers knew that they could reach the women. They knew women were listening, so they wanted to sell them stuff that they were using in their home. And again, it was the time. Women stayed home and cleaned and did this household stuff, and so the marketers went after that market, and it was a very successful program for them. We see another radio program. It was more of the drama for night, and one of the most interesting nighttime dramas was called War of the Worlds. It only aired once. It was a live airing. It aired on October 30th of 1938, so it was Devil's Night, basically. And it was a program about a Martian invasion of the Earth. And now you got to remember, back in these days, all they had were radios. TV wasn't out yet, or it was just slightly coming out. But everybody pretty much had a radio in their homes. And what this company did, Orson Welles, basically aired this War of the Worlds in a way that made it sound like a real newscast. And so when people would turn it on, if they didn't catch the first minute of the program where they said this was just a reenactment or a show, the rest of the program actually made it sound like a real news program, and people really went into a panic, and people were scared because they really thought the Martians were invading. It lasted for about an hour. It caused a public outcry, and a lot of things were changed because of this program and how they do it, and no longer can you broadcast a show and make it sound like a real newscast. Many listeners believe that we actually had a Martian invasion. People actually went out in the area where they claimed that this was happening with guns, and they were looking for the UFOs in the skies and so forth. So it was really, really kind of a big deal. Really caused a public panic. Let's move into the 1960s and up to today with radio. We see FM having a reemergence. We'll talk about a little bit here. We'll backtrack just for a few minutes. Obviously, in our notes, we talked about Edward Armstrong being the father of FM. He invented FM, or discovered frequency modulation, back in the 30s. We know what happened to Armstrong. He ended up selling all of his rights to the FM to radio stations and smaller companies around the country. By 1941, we had 50 FM stations on the air. So some stations like the FM, we talked about what the difference between FM and AM was, and as far as quality goes, FM was far superior than AM, although FM wouldn't reach as far as AM, but we had much more clarity with FM, so we did have some stations jump on board. But the only problem was 1941, we saw a major world event happening. We saw World War II getting stirred up, if you will. And because we got into World War II, the United States did, all FM development stopped at this point because we needed all the resources to go to the war effort. So any improvements, any manufacturing of FM equipment or technology basically came to a halt at this point. We talked about RCA. They didn't want to have anything to do with FM. They actually took him to court with patent infringements. RCA was heavily invested in AM and starting to get involved with TV. RCA actually pressured the FCC to change all the FM frequencies, and the FCC listened, and they did. They moved them to where they are today. The problem was that when they did this, all of your radio that you had in your home couldn't even get to the other frequencies. So basically, this move made all the existing FM stations obsolete because nobody could pick them up. So you had to buy a new radio in order to get the FM stations. So it was kind of a jerky move that RCA did. It was also kind of a weird marriage between RCA and the government allowed this to happen, but it did. Um, once TV started up, we saw maybe a reemergence of interest in the FM spectrum, if you will. By 1949, many FM stations had shut down because TV kicked in and AM was so popular, and FM had this problem with the frequency. So even though we saw some FM interest, the FM stations just couldn't make any money. So we saw by 1949, 1950, a lot of the stations would shut down. We knew what happened with Armstrong. The one thing I didn't tell you was that he actually wrote a note to his wife apologizing for what he was about to do, and then he took the almighty plunge out of a 13-story apartment building and killed himself because basically he went broke, and he thought his FM technology would really make him a lot of money, and he had invested basically his whole life savings into this venture. Once FM stations started making money, and eventually they did, ironically enough, RCA quickly started an FM development program. So RCA really wasn't if you look back in history, RCA was kind of this company that wanted to take total control. They didn't want to get into FM, but then once they saw FM stations starting to make money eventually, then they became the company to start developing FM. So once they got Armstrong out of the way, FM really kind of took off with RCA. Let's talk a little bit about the power of FM, and I'm talking about the radiation power of stations. The highest power permitted by the government with FM stations today is 100,000 watts. So you might have some other stations that you hear out there, especially in the Grand Rapids market. We'll talk about those in a few minutes that are higher than 1,000 watts. We'll talk about how they can do that. But the government allocates not only the frequency, but also allocates the power. And as of today, 100,000 watts is as big as you can transmit. If you were on the air prior to this ruling and you were higher than 100,000 watts, they grandfathered you in, and so they let you continue with these high-powered stations. The highest powered station in the United States was built, ironically enough, by RCA, and it was built in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This station is B93 right now, and they operated at 320,000 watts. At what time they actually had a permit to use 550,000 watts, so that's how they became known as the highest watted station in the country. There were two other high-powered stations in the country at the time that got grandfathered in. One was AFM in Birmingham, Alabama at 540,000 watts, and the other one was actually in Grand Rapids, and they were Wood FM, and they were at about 256,000 watts. So we had Grand Rapids making a pretty big impact with FM radio back in its day. In the 60s, one of the things that happened to help FM sales, the FCC opened up more spectrum space for the FM. They didn't move the spectrum, they just added more space, which allowed more radio stations to develop. One of the biggest things we talked about was the broadcast of FM. You were able to broadcast in stereo. You had a stereo sound, so it was much better. So once people really started grabbing hold of FM and getting FM stations, people really liked it. We saw in 1967, one of the things that the FCC passed was the non-duplication rule. So we had a lot of AM stations buy into FM. They had a sister FM station, and they basically just did a simulcast between their AM and FM stations. And so in 67, the FCC banned this, and so if you owned an FM station, you had to do your own programming. Because of this, we saw what was called freeform radio, and it was basically came to fruition. During this time, too, DJs had the freedom to play whatever they wanted because they needed something to play. They couldn't rebroadcast their AM programming, so they had to invent stuff. They had to create stuff. We also saw, by the 1970s, something called format. And even though we had something we called format in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s, we didn't call it format at the time. 70s, we started calling it format radio. One of the biggest emergent formats in radio back then was AOR, album-oriented rock. This came out really strong in the 1970s. Another spin-off of album-oriented rock was something called active rock, where the radio stations actually got the listeners involved in what they were doing. WRIF in Detroit had something called the Dread Cards. Detroit rockers engaged in the abolition of disco. So we had this whole group of people that hated disco, and so WRIF created this card that you could go get. And it was a card that you could use at different businesses around the city and the state to get discounts and so forth. So the active rock really became an integral part of the radio formats, and we see this active rock or active consumer involvement in radio and TV stations really take hold later down the road, and we'll get more into that in our next section. By 1967, we see the birth of NPR, National Public Radio, and PBC. And no, that's not a typo. It's not PB. It is called PBC. The National Public Broadcasting Corporation was created, and these were the first non-commercial networks. And we'll talk more about PBC later when it gets into the television realm. We also see with radio, as it grows through the 70s and 80s and 90s, a new pattern of ownership. We see all these small radio stations owned by basically mom and pops getting bought out by large corporations. We see mergers happening and formats changing to make their large companies more complementary with other holdings that they have. By 2004, radio reaches 94% of the population every week, and that is huge. So even by 2004, where television is strongly in place, radio still has a very strong reach. And in recent studies, between 2014 and the end of 2015, we see a new emergence of radio happening, which is really an amazing process, because a lot of people thought once TV came in, we were going to see the end of radio, but in fact we have not, and actually radio is growing. We see the digital impact of radio, we see satellite radio, we see the Sirius XM merger that happened back in July of 2008, which created about 18.5 million subscribers. Sirius actually paid XM $3.3 billion to buy out them. One of the things that happened, though, is that created an instant monopoly, and the government obviously frowns on monopolies. So one of the things they did was they agreed to a 3-year price cap, and they set aside 8% of full-time audio channels for public interest and minority programming. And so if you have Sirius XM, which I do, which I hate in some cases, but when you're traveling across the country, it's nice. We see that they set aside certain programming for certain interest groups and things like that. Since 2001, we see another emerging radio aspect take off called LPFM, and it's low power FM. You see LPFM at any drive-in movie theater that you might find in the country. Now there's not too many of those, but instead of putting the speaker on your window and rolling the window up, we actually can tune in to a radio station. You might see it at the airport. You can tune into the parking information or traffic information along the highway. You might see it when you go into certain communities, tune to this FM station, and you can hear about the upcoming events in the community. Pirate stations were unlicensed radio stations that took hold as well. They were basically ordered off the air if they wanted an LPFM license. The effective range or wattage of these LP are really small. It's only about 100 watts, so they really only had maybe about a 3 to 3.5 mile radius. But we see a lot of these things happening. Colleges have it. Some churches actually have these licenses. By 2007, we see about 800 or so LPFM stations on the air, and that's grown pretty substantially over the last couple of years. As of the end of 2015, we have about 1,364 stations on the air, and that's up about 215 stations since June of 2015. So we see this emergence of LPFM stations. A lot of smaller minority groups, some radical groups are getting involved as far as getting licenses. And so again, it's a very small radius that they can broadcast, but if they have a small community, they might want to get involved with it. Half of the license approved by the government were actually to right-wing Christian fundamentalist groups. They saw the need for LPFM, or they saw maybe what they could use for it. There's actually some church groups that actually are so large that people sit out in the parking lots and then they broadcast over their FM stations out to the parking lot. And that's a great thing for a lot of people. Let's talk a little bit about the future of radio technology, where it's starting to go to today. A new term that's just come out is IoT, the Internet of Things. All right, it's kind of a new technology or a new term. I don't know if you've heard of it, but basically it deals with communications and technologies with wearable devices or smart devices. So we see the Fitbits that a lot of people are wearing. So radio is really getting involved with these wearable smart devices. No power or low power radio communication is no doubt going to be the future of, or it is going to be the future of this Internet things. It has to be. So we're not sure exactly how it's going to play a role into this smart technology, but they're thinking that maybe they can broadcast to these devices, or these devices could actually broadcast out to other people. Not sure about where it's going, but they just know that they're going to get into it. But radio is definitely looking into growing their business through these smart wearables. To what degree, to what end, we're not sure, but they are really heavily investing into it right now. And the book is open to see what really happens with it. It'll be interesting to see how they use that technology, whether it's you can transmit from your device to the person you're jogging with device, or whatever it might be. Who knows? And there's some talk of maybe not even broadcasting, music or whatever. It might be broadcasting information from your smart device to something else. Who knows? So we'll see what happens with that. So that ends this section, section 1. Again, this ends all the notes for exam 1. You'll have 1 hour to take it, and again, it covers lectures 1, 2, 3, and then 4. Have a great week.